And welcome back, everyone. Today we are having a look at this 3 versus 3 rook endgame with an extra b pawn, in this case for white for the attacking side. And this endgame is super simple. White just wants to bring the king to the queen side, and if black is careful and pushes f6 g5, is going to make a draw in most of the cases. That was it for today. Thank you guys for watching. Obviously, this is not the case. That was a small joke on my part. This is probably one of the most complicated ones of those rook endgames. From my experience, like I spent now a couple of hours trying to understand all of the details of this endgame, but from what I can tell, the more white's pawn advances to the queen side, or black's pawn if it's the other way around, the more complicated and difficult it becomes. Well, difficult is another question, but at least complicated and sharp, because if the pawn is so much further on the queen side, then white's only winning plan is basically to bring the king and go there. And what black often does then is grab 1 or 2 pawns on the king side and then sacrifice the rook for this passed pawn. And then it's just going to be a race. Is white going to be in time to get back to the king side and stop black's pawns? And then we'll just end up rook up. Or is black in time to push one of the pawns to queen, and then it would most likely end in a draw. I tried to structure this video as concisely as possible, and what I want to do is basically show you the most important positions which can arise. The one you see right here, let's say b6 was white's last move, is probably the best thing which black can get. Let's start off by saying that. Because black's rook always wants to be on b3 if the position is like this, so that white cannot go king g2. This is something we've seen in the other endgames as well. And once white goes king f1, then what black wants to do is rook b2. You always want to cut off the king so that it has a harder time to approach the queen side. This is rule number 1. Rule number 2 in this endgame, it becomes a bit different than with the d and with the c pawn, obviously. In general, the ideas are similar. Black always wants to have the rook behind the pawn and wants to cut off white's king, and in a timely manner get some counterplay with f6 g5 if it's possible, or activate the king. But here it gets quite concrete. So let me start off by showing you a couple of examples. So this is my first diagram. Here, white's last move was king f3. And now white has a pretty good version here overall. Because white's king is very close to getting to the queen side, only 3 more moves to hit the rook with a tempo, and then white's pawn is going to roll down the board pretty fast. Here, black does not have the luxury to go for the f6 and g5 plan. Here, black should go for king f6. And after king e3, now there are still sort of 2 choices to hold the draw, either g5 or still king e6 is also possible here, with this idea to grab the pawn whenever white runs away with the king to the queen side. Although here it's already a bit tricky. In this position, black has only 1 move to hold a draw, king d6, stopping b6 to b7. But I, in general, would recommend you, whenever you can get counterplay on the king side, in this type of endgame with the b pawn, you should probably take the chance to do so. For example, here after g5, take. Even though black's pawn structure is ruined, the king at least is getting active, and black typically has the idea to push f5 and f4 in those endgames and get rid of the weakness, and also at the same time, in some cases, create an outside passed pawn. This is one of my lines here. If king d3, rook b2, f3, otherwise we can take the pawn. Generally, of course, I should mention that whenever white takes on f7, this endgame is just a very clear draw with 2 versus 1. So for example, f3, rook b3 check, king c4, then we pick up the pawn on f3, and this is going to be a draw. The rook will sacrifice itself, for example, if white brings the king, and yeah, king a7, rook b7, and it's going to be a draw like this. So let's move on to the next diagram. So this is the first one. If white's king is on f3, which of course, if we have the chance with black, we should avoid that. But if he does that, then we should immediately try to activate the king with king f6 and then push g5 or go over with the king to e6. Now let's have a look at my next diagram. For example, in this position. So if white does not have the rook on the 7th rank, but the pawn on b6 already. Here we have a couple of possibilities. I would recommend you here to go for the plan with f6. I think it's probably the most straightforward way of handling the position, to say the very least. It is also possible to play king f6, and I guess it's a matter of style. This is also a draw. King f6, king f1, and now just a move rook b2. King e1, king f5, activating the king to d1, and now whenever he brings the king, we can take on f2. For example, king c1, rook f3, king c2, rook f2 check, and then we always try to get from behind again, and if b7, rook b1, white can win the rook for sure in a line like this, but black is simply going to grab all of the pawns there, and again, a similar outcome will come. For example, I don't know, something like this should be a draw, g5, b8, queen, take, and some of the pawns are just going to run down the board. Even black has 3 pawns here, should be a draw somehow. So let's go back a little bit. So I've already mentioned that this is possible, but I would mostly recommend to go f6 and g5. Now, why is that the case? At least with f6 and g5, we're mostly creating a weakness on h4. And if white takes on g5, then we have the chance to get the outside passer. But if you go for that, you need to be quite careful about one thing. For example, if white pushes b7 here, then g5 would be a losing move, because now white could take and now go f4. And this endgame with the pawn being on b7 already is typically a draw if the pawns are kind of in a symmetrical position. But if there can be some imbalance like this, and especially if white can create this f pawn, then it's lost for black. Because here after h4, f5 will come. Example, h3 check. Here, and well, we can sacrifice this pawn, but white's winning plan is going to be to play f6 check. If the king takes, there's going to be rook f8 check, followed by queen on b8, and white is just winning the rook. If the king goes here, then rook h8 wins. Rook takes b7 and rook h7, with the check picking up the rook on b7. So this is of course important if you're entering this one, but you can go for that one. For example, if white goes for f3 here, then it's possible to go for g5, because now only now white can go b7, and here we have this extra tempo, and we can use it, for example, by going rook b2 check. If we make a slow move like king h7 or rook b6, for example, then white would be winning again by playing f4. But after going rook b2 check, now one thing which you should remember is that this endgame, now after king h3, we can sacrifice the pawn, and this is now a draw, because now white does not have any more winning chances here by pushing the pawn to g6, and black is just going to wait. Black can wait all the time. Whenever white brings the king to c6, then we give a check, because then white threatens to move the rook on b8 and get a queen. But then we can continue checking and then go back to b2 once again. And this pawn on g3 now does not do anything, because, well, white can push it to g6 all the way, but it does not do anything, and we have the king on g7. White needs to provoke our king to f7 to be able to win this, so that he has this trick with rook h8 in the end. So let's go back a little bit. This is quite concrete, yeah. So we cannot do this all the time, and this is also why it was quite difficult for me now to kind of get a full recommendation on how to defend it. And I feel quite bad for having to show this now, because, well, maybe king f6 is simpler for you, and I think everyone should just kind of choose themselves which ones of the defensive methods they like the most, and then choose that one. But as I said, in general, f6 and g5 is kind of the classical understanding on how to approach this endgame. At least that's how I always learned it, to get counterplay. So therefore, this is my kind of number one for the moment. So here, white has a couple of other choices, like rook b7 I check, king h6 always. You don't want to get cut off on the 7th rank. And then black is ready to go g5 on the next move. If f4, g5, there's actually just one nice line. If white goes f5 here, we have this stalemate trick with rook g3 check. And if white takes, then it's going to be stalemate. This is one other interesting line here, but it turns out to be a draw with the accurate move rook to b2 check. And black, typically in those endgames now, often just likes to give a couple of checks, and then when the king runs out, then we can go h4 with sufficient counterplay. For example, here rook b8, h3, and if white goes after this pawn, well, it's still protected, but at least the pawn on b6 is going to fall as well. So let's go back a couple of moves. This was one of the other positions, which we are approaching now. I've put it into diagrams. If white has this kind of perfect type of position, which, yeah, it can arise in a game if he has this, if we have some kind of forcing line that leads into this type of endgame, and white already has the king on f3 and goes king e3, is probably the most kind of dangerous position which we can get from the black side. But it is still a draw actually here. But here black needs to be incredibly precise. If white's king is on e3 here, then we have to play for king f6. f6 and g5 is way too slow here. If we go f6, king d3, g5, king c3, rook back to b1, and king c4 is going to come, I don't know, king g6 maybe, and king c5. And even if king f5 comes at some point, we could think about taking and going b7. But I guess here in this case, we can just go king c6, then move the rook and then go b7. I don't know, for example, king g4, let's say rook f8, I guess, looks natural. And if takes here, takes maybe rook f6, should be winning. King g5, rook f3, for example, stopping the pawn on the third rank. And this b6 pawn is going to the side. So black needs to play king f6 here and activate the king instead. I guess the most natural try here for white is king d3. And here it gets pretty insane. Here black has only one move to hold the draw, which is the move king f5. Which looks way more counterintuitive than the move king to e5. Looks more natural, just bringing the king into the center. And the reason for that we're going to see in a second. After king e5, white goes king c3, rook b1, king c4, king to d6, and now f3. And here with black to move, this is lost, but with white to move, it's a draw. This you can remember if you can. I don't know if I'm even gonna remember it after recording this video. Like it's quite complex, but it's quite surprising to me. I just found this out before, and yeah, at least you can kind of boast to your friends with this knowledge that you know this type of position. Anyway, probably never gonna appear in any of our games, but it's still kind of interesting. To get an explanation about that exactly, let me go back a couple of moves. So here after f3, I don't know what black can try. If king c6, then white wins by going rook f8, I believe. Maybe you can also give a check first, but rook f8. And then after taking on b6, rook takes f7, and then rook f6 is going to come most likely, or the king can also run over, but I don't think there's any way to hold the g6 pawn. So let's go back to this exact position with just white to move here. So what should white do here? King c4, now black can go king d6. And the thing is now, if white goes after this pawn now, well, first of all, we can take on b6. We could also go back to e7, I guess. But now we can take on b6, take on f7, and now the king is one square close, so we can go king e6 here, and then everything is good for us, and it's a draw. So white could try king b7 here as well, and now king to e6 is the only way to hold the draw. Again, with the point that if white's king approaches now, then he cannot get in here because the b7 square is blocked. So rook c1 check, king to d4, rook d1 check, king c3, and now back rook b1. Kind of the same motive we've seen if white's rook is on b8 and his pawn is on b7. So g4 was another line here, and here black holds the draw by taking and going f5. Also not entirely easy here, but at least trying to make a passed pawn for some counterplay. I'm just going to show you my main line here. h5, take on h5, take on h5, f4, king d4, and now rook to h1 held the draw, rook b8 and king d7. Rook takes h5 would be lost because then white can go b7, and then there's going to be a check, and then white can queen. So this is one of the positions. Yeah, here, like this is something you probably need to remember. It's like I guess you can calculate this during a game, but it would be extremely difficult. So again, as a reminder, this position, where was it? This position with white to move is a draw, but this position with black to move is lost for black. I wanted to mention another position which I felt is quite important if white wants to try something, because like if black knows this defense by putting the rook to the third rank, by the way, I think we did not go through that. I'm kind of inserting this after recording the other stuff because I had a feeling like we did not go through that yet. So if black knows this kind of technique, then what white should try, I believe, is to go for f3 and then preparing king d1 and king c1. This is kind of the only idea to do something. And here black has a couple of different possibilities, but also a few ways to go wrong. I think the most straightforward one is now to run with the king. g5, it's important that here it does not work, because after taking rook b8, now white often has the idea just to go b7, followed by giving a check with the rook. King f6, and now king d1, and the king is running over, and after king e7, king c1, the king is just going to approach, and here black would be lost. But I think king e5 is quite straightforward, king d1, and now this quite counterintuitive move, I would say f5 is, in my opinion, the cleanest solution, just trying to push f4 on the next move. King d4 is also possible, but it is a little bit more difficult. I will just show you the line I had here. Now f5 again is an important move, king c2, and now king f4, because taking here runs into rook d3, rook b3. So king f2, f4, king g2, king c3, king h3 only move, king c4, and apparently this is a draw, because after king c5 then black can probably always take on g3 because there's no more rook d3 check, rook b3. So that's why f5 I feel like is a little bit more straightforward, and we want to go f4 on the next move with black, for example like this, f4. If white goes rook b8 in those positions, then we can go f4, and after take b7, the king finds a safe haven on g3. So I just wanted to say this about this one right here. Black should play king e5 and f5, and then it should be reasonably easy. Again, if white takes on f7, then black can take on b6 with a drawn rook endgame. So let's move on to the other ones, which I still wanted to show you. This is the first one. Now we had the rook in front of the pawn, which probably is going to rise in most of our games. But this is one example where black can make quite a comfortable draw, because first of all, his king is quite close to the rook on c5. And after it appears on d6, it's probably kind of a forced draw already, more or less at least. Like if white goes king f1 here, for example, then well, rook b2 is a nice move first, but king f6 would also be possible immediately. But rook b2, again, remember our defensive idea here. Whenever king g2, rook b3. Whenever king f1, then rook b2. King e1, king f6. And now what white could do is try to bring the rook also in front of the pawn. But even here, like I would say that the king even can come on numerous occasions, and whenever white goes after this pawn, then we would have again some sort of drawn rook endgame like this. So I checked here king e5, b6 also, then king d5, rook f6, king e5, for example. And again, if white takes here, we can take on b6 with a draw. King d1, rook takes f2 now is possible. I'm actually wondering if we could also go king e6 here. King c1 and then this one. Maybe it could be similar, even though here, yeah, I'm not sure about this. Now b6 could be a little bit close. I had rook takes f2 first, king c1, and now rook e2. So this is even more precise. Like this, we can get behind the pawn again. b6, rook e8, b7. Here it is a little bit kind of a race. Rook b5, king e6, but black in the end is holding. I will just show you the line which I had here. c4, and the pawn endgame here is a draw, because in the end black is able to protect the f7 pawn, and it is still a draw because black cannot make any progress here and cannot run to white's kingside himself, because the pawn on f7 and then the pawn on g6 would drop. So if the rook is like on the side here, on the 5th rank specifically, then bringing the king is probably kind of the only option which is left, because now f6 and g5 is not always such a viable option, especially since the king will not find the counterplay via g6, f5, since the rook is on the 5th rank. Okay, let's move on to this one. Another example which was actually from a real game between Wojtaszek and Yevgeny Nair, I believe. At least that's what it says here. And in this endgame, white is actually winning. So there we see again that those endgames are incredibly concrete. Before we had the same just with g6 and king g7, but since black does not have that here, it's all a little bit different. And also another huge factor, of course, is that in the other one, black's rook was behind the pawn, which is of course a much better version for him. So in the game, I'll just show you basically how it ended. It went like this: king g2, white just brought the king to the center, and black did get behind the pawn, but it was sort of too late at this point because white's king is already so active. This was how it went, and white even ran in with his king himself to e5. King c8, this was how the game then concluded, and he got to f6. And actually he made a mistake here with rook h7. Instead, rook c7 would have been better, and then like this. Also very complicated stuff here. How is this actually winning? I guess it should be Zugzwang at some point. That's quite beautiful actually. And then king g6, and white is going to win the pawn on h6 because of Zugzwang. That's quite nice. Anyway, later on, Wojtaszek won. I think this is kind of going a little bit too deep in this endgame, but I just wanted to show you that those small differences do make quite a huge difference in the evaluation, especially the placement of black's rook. So let's move on, whoops, my mistake, to the fourth rank. Here, I think it's quite obvious that black should go for f6 and g5 because bringing the king will not be kind of a viable alternative here. Because even if the king runs, then rook takes f7 is always going to be possible, because then if black takes on b4, there's going to be rook f6, and then g6 is going to fall. But f6 and g5, this is quite simple at this point, because now the rook has to leave, and then something like king g6. And even whenever white's king leaves, then king c2, rook f3 becomes another option, and then we can take on f2, and then often get back with the rook again. Or with the king also. It was also possible to play, it was actually important to play rook f1 at this point. And after king b4, now king e6 back. And the king is helping with the defense on the queen side. And here black is in time to make a draw, even though it's also quite close here. If white goes king c5, if I look at it, I would not be so happy with black, but yeah, should be a draw now with king d7. It gets behind opponent. Generally, material here is already quite limited. So here, quite obvious that f6 and g5 should be the way to go. Now, the final chapter of this video, if white's rook is behind the pawn. I was quite curious about those endgames, and I made some diagrams on wherever white's pawn is, how the evaluation changes. So I was surprised to see that with white's rook being on b1 and black's rook being on b3, that it's actually quite a simple draw for black, and he can do many different things to hold it. Like, for example, if king f1, even king g8, I think, was still a draw. King e2, king g7, and something like this. So if black loses a lot of time, even like this, it is still a draw in the end. Like, this is what I was looking at. And then, again, if the king runs, then after king c7, black is going to take on b7, sacrifice the rook, and then the pawns on the king side are going to save the draw for black. So I just wanted to demonstrate that black can even lose two tempos like this and it's still a draw, even with not f6 alone, but also king f6, also draw here. But of course, you could go king f6 immediately, or f6 and g5, which again would be my preferred method, and rook f3, and for example like this, just an immediate draw. So now let's move on to what happens if the pawn is not on b4, but instead on b3. Where do we have it? Here. So what do you think? Is this still a draw or is it winning? It is still a draw because black can play f6, king to f3, and then g5, and the rook on b4 always makes this counterplay on the pawn on h4. It is quite a big difference though. I did not check this, but I could imagine if we have the same position, just that the pawn is on h2 and not on h4, then it could be kind of a different story, because then it's not going to be so easy for black to find counterplay. Then I would say that it might be lost, like if the pawn is on h3 or h2. Please verify that by yourself. I will not be responsible if that was incorrect, but that would be kind of my human guess now, because black simply does not have this counterplay with g5 anymore. But here, f6, king f3, g5, and whenever the king comes, then at some point we can take here, take on h4, maybe even immediately, and get back with the rook behind the pawn, and something like this should be a draw. So now you can guess what happens if the rook is on b5 and the pawn is on b4. this is kind of where it cuts off. Here it's definitely lost. But even here I checked it out of curiosity. f6 now does not do anything, so this will be quite simply winning for white because black can never take the pawn on h4 with his rook. But black's best defensive plan here is still king f6, king f3, and now king to f5. King e5 is quite simply lost after king e3 and then king d3. And black is going to be in Zugzwang. If the king moves back, then king c4 comes. And if the rook moves back, then typically b5 comes. And those pawn endgames typically are also lost, like here. Take king e5, king f6. King f5 is the most stubborn defense at this point. King e3 now, f6, king d4, and g5. White is still winning here, but he needs to be a little bit precise. At this point, for example, king takes h4. King c5 was one of the only moves to actually win the game. For example, if b7, then king g4 was already a draw because king f3 comes, or h4, h3, and black is holding here. But after king c5, king g4, again, white needs to find one important idea, which is a move rook g1 check. And after king f3, now rook h1. And after all of this, probably, like as I understood it, the very least which can come out is that white is going to still need to prove this queen versus rook, which I guess is, yeah, kind of a success if you have this endgame. Actually, with a great defense, this endgame is very difficult to win from the white side. Even if this pawn is not here, black has this third rank defense. Like if I'm playing this against a computer, I'm pretty sure I would not be able to win this, because there is some very deep maneuver on how to then break this third rank defense. I'm sure you can find this in some endgame manual by Dvoretsky, but if you want me to make a video on that, let me know in the comment section down below. It's probably gonna cost me some time to go through all of that, but it would be quite interesting for me actually. Maybe then I will finally be able to do that. Also, Nepo was not able to win it against Magnus in one rapid game one, so just as a reminder that it's actually not so simple. So I think that was it for today's video. We've had a look at the white's rook being in front of the pawn, at the side of the pawn, and behind the pawn. Obviously, if the most typical scenario is typically this one with the rook in front of the pawn, and it also tends to be the most complicated one and perhaps also difficult for black. Again, keep in mind you always want this rook on b3 whenever white's king is on g2, and if king f1 comes, then you always want to go rook b2. Apart from that, it's kind of a matter of style on which defensive technique you want to rely. I typically like this idea of f6 and g5, but you do need to be a bit careful here with this one. There is, again, as a reminder, this one specific case. If white's king is already quite active, then you need to go for this king f6. And here it's extremely difficult for black to know this idea with king f5, f3, and then king e5, which now does save a draw. Anyway, guys, I hope you did enjoy this video. If you did, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Next up, we have the a pawn, which I don't know if it's going to be as complicated at this one or maybe even more, but we'll probably find out about that together. Probably it's going to come out after the Croatian League, which starts on Saturday. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'm going to see you guys soon.